Okay, guys, Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley, both kings. Who made more money and who was better with money? So let's go ahead and talk about it. So both of these famous people, I was wondering who came out ahead financially, Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley. So both of these extremely successful artists both passed away really young, left behind large legacies that continue on to today. But when you look at the money that they earned, how they spent it, and what they left behind, this story is a lot more interesting than a lot of people realize. So first off, how much did they earn throughout their lifetime? So we'll start with Elvis Presley. So I looked him up and he sold over 600 million records worldwide. And still to this day, he's recognized as the most successful solo artist of all time. During his peak, he was commanding $1 million per performance, and he made over $31 million off of his movie productions alone. Now, if we jump over to Michael Jackson, supposedly he earned between $500 and $750 million through his career. So that includes things like touring, endorsements, album sales, and his stake in Sony. In fact, his music catalog with Sony was supposed to be one of the most valuable music assets in history. So both of these men made a staggering amount of money during their era, but the strange thing is neither one of them really died wealthy. So what was their net worth when they passed away? So this is actually the shocking part. So Elvis Presley, when he passed away in 1977, was only worth $5 million, which today is a lot of money, but in 1977, it was still a huge amount of money. But for somebody who was the biggest entertainer for over 20 years, $5 million is a number almost impossible to believe. But if we look at Michael Jackson, his situation was even more dramatic. Supposedly, when Michael Jackson passed away, he had a negative net worth of around $500 million. So not only did he spend everything that he earned, he spent hundreds of millions of dollars more that he didn't have. So in 2009, he passed away with basically $500,000 in debt. So you might be asking yourself, where did all of this money go? So when we look at Elvis Presley, the answer is pretty clear and well documented. Elvis Presley spent millions of dollars on real estate. He also had a nasty divorce with Priscilla. Allegedly, he had a prescription drug addiction. However, the biggest factor for his decline in net worth was his manager. His name is Colonel Tom Parker. So when they had negotiated their contract, supposedly Colonel Tom Parker was to receive 50% of his concert and his music income. And that's definitely higher than the industry norm. So imagine that everything that Elvis Presley was bringing in, 50% immediately went to someone else. That decision alone costed Elvis Presley probably hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, when we look at Michael Jackson, his spending habits were completely different. Supposedly, he would spend $50 million a year just maintaining his lifestyle. He famously had Neverland Ranch, which costed millions of dollars per year just to maintain. He also spent enormous amounts of money on art, various projects that didn't materialize, and various collectibles. In fact, allegedly, he would borrow heavily against his assets just to fund his lifestyle. So both of these guys passed away really young. So what happened to their estate after they passed away? So as you can see, both of their stories are quite similar. However, their estate after they passed away actually goes in two different directions. So when Elvis Presley passed away, the estate was worth about $5 million. However, there were substantial debts alongside in that estate. That's when Priscilla stepped in and created the Elvis Presley Enterprises in 1981. And she basically transformed Graceland into a booming tourist attraction. And talk about turning around a ship. By 1993, supposedly the estate was worth $100 million and debt-free in just 12 years. And in 2023, Forbes reported that the Elvis Presley estate earned $100 million in just 1 year. So that's really quite impressive. Now, if we look at Michael Jackson, his estate has done something even more dramatic. Supposedly after his death in the following years, the estate has generated over $2 billion. So his debts were paid. And then after that, his albums, his catalogs, his various projects, they were all transformed into a structured operation that produces millions of dollars per year. And allegedly in 2024, the estate closed on a large deal worth about $600 million to purchase Michael Jackson's recorded masters. That's supposedly the largest deal for a single artist. So as you can see, both estates went from broke to extraordinary. However, Michael Jackson's estate was much more dramatic, bigger, and faster than anything Elvis Presley's estate ever accomplished. So which one of these guys made smarter business decisions during their lifetime? But when digging through the data, honestly, neither one of these guys were really that savvy with their money, but for very different reasons. First, we'll look at Elvis Presley. The biggest mistake that Elvis Presley seemed to have made was trusting Colonel Tom Parker with his money. It seems like Tom Parker controlled large aspects of Elvis Presley's professional career, and every step that he took, Tom Parker was there to take a large portion of every bit of income. One of the biggest controversies for Colonel Tom Parker is that supposedly he was an illegal immigrant, and because of that, he wouldn't allow Elvis Presley to tour internationally internationally. Just that one decision alone could cost an artist hundreds of millions of dollars, especially somebody like Elvis Presley. Now, when we look at Michael Jackson actually made some pretty smart moves in certain areas. In fact, in 1985, he supposedly bought the Beatles catalog for $47.5 million. And when we jump ahead to when Michael Jackson passed away, that catalog was worth close to $1 billion, supposedly. So that one investment alone was really brilliant. However, by the time they sold half the catalog to Sony, that basically was wiped out by Michael Jackson's debt. So when we look at Elvis Presley, he lost a lot of money by poor management from Tom Parker, and Michael Jackson lost all of his money just basically because he was spending a huge amount. So whose musical legacy is worth more today? I think this comparison is really going to settle things between Elvis Presley and Michael Jackson. If we look at Elvis Presley's estate, it's estimated by a lot of analysts to be worth between $400 million and $500 million. Supposedly it earns about $17 million per year, which is a large number. That is down from 2023 when they earned about $100 million from their biopic film Post. Now, when we look at Michael Jackson's estates, in 2026, a lot of analysts put his estate to be valued about $2 billion, so almost 4 times that of Elvis Presley's. So a lot of that is driven by his music rights, licensing deals, and posthumous projects. In fact, more recently, the Michael Jackson biopic is in theaters, and supposedly the estate received $10 million upfront for that, and supposedly they're going to get about 25% of the revenue from that film. So if we look at the current estate value between Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson is worth about 4 times that of the Presley estate, and that's on top of digging out of the massive debt that Michael Jackson had when he passed away. So aside from the finances, Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley, which one of these guys sold more records during their lifetime? So this one's kind of interesting. It really depends on how you calculate record sales, because Elvis Presley was operating at a different time. So supposedly Elvis Presley sold 600 million records during his lifetime, and he is recognized as the #1 solo music artist of all time in the Guinness Book of World Records. Now, if we jump over to Michael Jackson, he sold 750 million records through his lifetime. In fact, if you are old enough to remember his Thriller album, that is the #1 selling record of all time. It sold about 66 million records. Also, one thing to note is Elvis Presley did have a 20-year start on Michael Jackson. Also, during the Elvis Presley era, the measurement of success was just record sales. So both of these guys have set records that still to this day have never been broken. And when we look at Elvis Presley, if you think back in that time, worldwide distribution was much smaller than the options that Michael Jackson had available during his lifetime. So which one of these guys had more impact on musical history? So this is up for debate. So rather than giving my opinion, I went ahead and looked up to see what the music industry says about these two folks. So if we talk about Elvis Presley, he's widely credited as bringing rock and roll back to the United States and making it mainstream. He is credited with blending black music traditions with country and with pop, and that basically changed music for everything after Elvis Presley. A lot of people say that without Elvis, there would be no Beatles or even Rolling Stones, and quite possibly even modern pop wouldn't exist without Elvis Presley. Now, if we jump over to Michael Jackson took what Elvis Presley had started and then globalized it throughout the world. In fact, he's widely credited as the first artist to dominate all music industry throughout the entire world, not in just certain countries. His music videos were groundbreaking, and they completely changed the way that music was marketed after Michael Jackson. His entertaining dance moves influenced every performer that came after Michael Jackson. In fact, even artists today still try to mimic Michael Jackson's dance moves. And he did it all while being a black artist who broke barriers on MTV at a time when really that wasn't the norm. So as you can see, both of these men, Elvis Presley and Michael Jackson, changed music forever. Elvis Presley changed music in America. However, Michael Jackson changed music throughout the world. So you might be asking yourself, is there anything that Elvis Presley did financially better than Michael Jackson? I would say yes, absolutely. If we look at Elvis Presley, his fame lives on even 50 years after his death. He has a huge cult following still. In fact, Graceland supposedly brings in 600,000 visitors per year. And a side fact, it's the second most visited house in the US aside from the White House. Also, Elvis Presley never had the legal controversies that Michael Jackson had. Most of his legacy is smaller in dollar value. However, it has had much less controversies and less public drama. So who wins on the financial comparison, Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley? Based off of everything that I've been able to find on public records, it's clear that Michael Jackson wins financially, especially since his estate is worth 4 times that of Elvis Presley. It's even more impressive considering that the estate was basically negative $500 billion when Michael Jackson passed away, and has brought that up to a positive $2 billion supposed estimate of the estate. And you compare that with Elvis Presley that started at $5 million when Elvis Presley passed away and is worth about $400 million currently. So both turnarounds are really quite impressive. However, the estate of Michael Jackson is historic. So the most fascinating thing is both of these guys made hundreds of millions of dollars through their lifetime, and both of them basically passed away broke. And sadly enough, the biggest financial success came after they passed away. So two kings of music, same story, different scale. So maybe the lesson between Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley is that earning money is completely different than managing money. Two completely different skills, and being the greatest entertainer in the world doesn't actually make you good at money management. So I started this curious about who made more money, Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley, but as you can see, the story is much more complicated and much more interesting after they passed away, what they did with their estates. Hope you found it interesting. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.